The storm howled outside the little cabin like a wounded beast, rattling the old wooden shutters. Inside, a woman in a worn brown coat held a sleeping boy close to her chest, his face pale and tired. Her name was Clara, a widow trying to survive the cold northern winter after losing her husband to an accident in the mines. She stared at the fading fire and wondered how much longer she could keep pretending everything would be okay. Just then, the door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside, broad-shouldered, rugged, his beard frosted with snow. It was Luke, the lumberjack who lived alone deep in the forest. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet. Clara had come to the lumber camp earlier that day, desperate and trembling. She had one request, one that made Luke freeze in place when he heard it. "Can you pretend to be my son's father, just for a while?" she asked softly, eyes glistening with shame and hope. Her voice cracked as she explained the town council was threatening to take her son, Daniel, away, claiming she couldn't provide a stable home. They wanted a man in the household, someone who could guide the boy. It wasn't love or lies she wanted, just a chance to keep her child. Luke's heart twisted at the thought. He knew loneliness too well, and in that trembling woman's plea, he heard an echo of his own emptiness. At first, Luke refused. He wasn't the kind of man who belonged in a family. His days were filled with access, pine trees, and silence. People whispered about his past, about the woman who left him years ago and the child he lost before birth. But that night, lying awake listening to the wind batter his cabin, he couldn't shake Clara's face from his mind or those tired eyes, that quiet strength. The next morning, before dawn, he packed his coat, stepped into the snow, and walked down to her small cottage by the edge of town. When she opened the door, she looked startled to see him. "I'll do it," he said simply. And from that moment, two broken souls began an unexpected chapter. The first days were awkward. Daniel didn't know what to make of the stranger who now sat at their table and helped with chores. Clara tried to act natural, introducing Luke as Mr. Walker, an old friend of her late husband. But soon, the little boy began following Luke everywhere, to the barn, the woodpile, even to the frozen stream. Luke found himself teaching Daniel how to whittle wood and light a fire. The boy laughed freely for the first time in months, and Clara noticed it with tears in her eyes. Slowly, the fake family started to feel real, even though they all knew it was built on borrowed roles. Then came the inspection day, when the councilman arrived to evaluate Clara's home. Luke stood tall beside her, his calloused hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder. The councilman frowned, flipping through papers, asking harsh questions. But when he saw the warmth between the three of them, the way the boy clung to Luke's arm, the steady confidence in Clara's voice, even he hesitated. By the end of the visit, he nodded curtly and left, muttering that everything seemed in order. As his carriage disappeared down the road, Clara turned to Luke, her lips trembling. "You saved us," she whispered. But Luke only smiled faintly. "Maybe you saved me first." Winter gave way to spring, and the days grew longer. Luke stayed on, fixing the roof, planting vegetables, mending fences. At night, he'd sit by the fire, reading Daniel bedtime stories in his deep, gentle voice while Clara sewed quietly beside them. Sometimes their hands brushed when they passed a cup or a tool, and something unspoken flickered in the air. They never talked about what would happen when the act was over. But both of them knew, the lines between pretending and feeling had begun to blur. Luke had found laughter again, and Clara found peace she thought she'd never feel. One afternoon, Clara's old neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, came by and whispered gossip from town. People were saying that Luke and Clara had married in secret. Clara's face burned with embarrassment. She tried to explain that it wasn't true, but Mrs. Whitmore only chuckled. "Well, dear, if it isn't yet, maybe it should be." That night, as Luke chopped firewood under a purple sunset, Clara stepped outside and watched him in silence. He looked up, met her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Something fragile and beautiful passed between them, like a promise unspoken. But peace doesn't last forever. One morning, a letter arrived, sealed with the stamp of the lumber company. Luke was being called back to the main camp for permanent work. It was steady pay and hard labor, but it meant leaving Clara and Daniel behind. That night, Clara sat by the fire, hands trembling as she folded the letter. "You should go," she said quietly. "You've done enough for us." Luke didn't answer at first. Then he stood, his voice low and rough. "I said I'd pretend to be your son's father, but I didn't pretend about you." The words hung heavy in the room. Before Clara could reply, he walked out into the night. Days turned into weeks. The cottage felt empty without him, the laughter gone, the nights colder. Daniel asked where Luke went, and Clara could only say he had to work. But each time the boy looked out the window, hoping to see the familiar tall figure returning from the forest, Clara's heart broke a little more. One rainy evening, Daniel grew sick, a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor came and went, leaving bitter medicine and grim silence. Clara prayed by the bedside, whispering for help, for hope, for Luke. On the third night, just as thunder rolled across the valley, there was a knock at the door. Clara rushed to open it, and there he was, drenched, tired, eyes full of worry. "I heard he was sick," Luke said breathlessly. He dropped his tools, knelt beside Daniel's bed, and held the boy's hand all night. When dawn came and the fever finally broke, Clara wept into Luke's shoulder. "You came back," she whispered. Luke looked at her, eyes soft. "I never really left." That spring, Luke built Daniel a wooden horse and carved their initials beneath the saddle, C, L, and D. Clara found it one morning and traced the letters with her fingertips. When Luke saw her, he froze, unsure if he'd gone too far. But she smiled through tears. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending," she said. The two stood there in the morning light, the air full of wildflowers and the sound of a new beginning. Months later, the whole town gathered for the small wedding by the river. Clara wore a simple white dress, Daniel carried the rings, and Luke stood tall in his best shirt. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," the townsfolk cheered, and even the stern councilman smiled. It wasn't a fairy tale, just three hearts that had found their way through pain and loneliness into something real. The storm that once surrounded them had finally quieted. Years passed, and their cottage became known as the house with laughter. Luke worked the forest, Clara baked for the village, and Daniel grew into a fine young man who never forgot the man who chose to love him, not out of duty, but out of heart. Whenever travelers asked about the wooden carving above their door, three letters entwined, Clara would smile and say, "It's our family story." It began with a question and ended with forever. Because sometimes, love doesn't start with a kiss or a promise. Sometimes it begins with a simple, trembling request, "Can you pretend to be my son's father?" And the courage of a lonely man who says yes, not knowing that one small act of kindness would change three lives forever. And in the quiet woods, where the pines whisper above the cottage, their laughter still echoes, soft, real, and everlasting.